Nokia, from 98% collapse to NVIDIA's billion-dollar bet. Picture building something for 150 years. You turn it into the largest company in your country. You control half the mobile phone market on the entire planet. Then in less than a decade, everything collapses. Your stock drops 98%. Your remaining staff sits in the office reading news articles about when their company is going to go bankrupt. That's not a hypothetical. That actually happened to Nokia. And what's more shocking than the collapse is what happened after it. Because in October 2025, Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, the man who built the most powerful chips in the AI era, stood in front of US lawmakers and announced a $1 billion investment into Nokia. Not an acquisition, not a merger. NVIDIA chose Nokia as their sole partner to build the next generation of AI-powered telecommunications infrastructure. The company the entire world declared dead in 2012 is now NVIDIA's biggest bet on the future. But to understand how this happened, we need to go back, way back, to a paper mill on the banks of a Finnish river in 1865. Nobody expected Nokia to become a technology company. Fredrik Idustam built a paper mill in southern Finland when the country was still part of the Russian Empire. 6 years later, he and his partner Leo Macallan formed a company named after the small town where their second mill stood, along the Nokia River. For the next century, Nokia had nothing to do with technology. They made rubber boots, telegraph cables, car tires. An incredibly boring company, but a profitable one. Then in 1967, 3 companies merged into Nokia Corporation. And in 1979, they entered the mobile phone business through a joint venture called Mobira. Their first phone, the Mobira Senator, launched in 1982. It weighed nearly 10 kilograms. Not something you carried, something you bolted into the floor of your car. This was a product for executives and the ultra-wealthy. And even then, phones were just a tiny side business for Nokia. All of that changed because of one man willing to do something nobody else in that boardroom would. In 1992, a 41-year-old executive named Jorma Alala took the CEO chair. He was running Nokia's mobile division, the most questioned unit in the company, the one the board had nearly sold off multiple times. But Alala saw something nobody else did. Digital cellular networks were about to explode, and whoever moved first would own the next decade. So he made a decision that sounded insane at the time. Sell the paper mills. Sell the rubber factories. Sell the cable business. Keep only one thing, the phones. The board thought he was gutting the company. Turns out he was building it. By 2000, Nokia accounted for 4% of Finland's entire GDP and 70% of the Helsinki stock market. Their market cap hit $303 billion. In a country of 5 million people, Nokia was the economy. Then they released the Nokia 3310, 126 million units sold, Snake became a global phenomenon, and a phone so durable it became a cultural legend. By 2007, Nokia controlled nearly 40% of the global mobile market, more than their 3 closest competitors combined. But that same year, someone in San Francisco was about to change everything. And Nokia was completely unprepared for what was coming. January 9, 2007. Steve Jobs walks onto a stage. We are calling it iPhone. The crowd explodes. And within days, Nokia had assembled an internal team, 9 people, some with C-suite access, to analyze the threat. Their conclusion, serious challenger in the high-end segment. The touchscreen interface could set a new standard for the entire market. Management read the report, then continued with their meetings. Nokia's engineers had torn the iPhone apart and found plenty of reasons not to worry. Too expensive to manufacture. Failed Nokia's drop tests. No physical keyboard. To Nokia's product teams, the iPhone was a fragile, overpriced niche device missing the basic features their customers expected. And for a while, the numbers proved them completely right. By the end of 2007, Nokia still controlled 50% of the smartphone market. Apple had less than 3%. A year later, Nokia sold 468 million phones, the best year in their entire history. From inside Nokia's headquarters in Espoo, the data was telling them they had already won. But 2 things were quietly eating through the foundation without anyone noticing. First, Android. Google and HTC launched the first Android phone in 2008. Nokia was no longer fighting one premium competitor. They were now fighting an open ecosystem pulling millions of developers toward a completely different platform. Second, and this is what truly sank Nokia, their answer to the iPhone turned out to be the biggest disaster they ever created themselves. Nokia called it the iPhone killer. The N97 launched in 2009 with a spec sheet designed to embarrass Apple on paper. 5-megapixel cam, slide-out keyboard, GPS twice the storage of the iPhone, a touchscreen, a more affordable price. 2 million units sold in the first 3 months. Then the reviews came in, and it was a disaster. The touchscreen barely registered touches. Symbian, Nokia's operating system, crashed constantly when running more than a handful of apps at the same time. And Nokia's App Store launched with roughly 1,000 applications, while Apple's App Store already had more than 50 times that number. The apps people actually wanted simply didn't exist on Nokia's platform. A few months later, Nokia did something almost unthinkable for a company their size. They apologized publicly. Annie Vanjoki, Nokia's executive VP of markets, went on record and called the N97 a tremendous disappointment for consumers. The company that had spent 15 years defining what a mobile phone meant was now apologizing for its flagship product. The board knew something had to change drastically. In September 2010, they brought in Stephen Elop, a former Microsoft executive and the first non-Finnish CEO in Nokia's 145-year history, with one mission: stop the bleeding. But what Elop did next made everything dramatically worse, faster than anyone could have imagined. Elop spent his first months learning exactly how deep Nokia's problems actually ran. What he found wasn't just a product problem. It was a platform crisis that was already beyond saving. 5 months after joining, he sent a company-wide memo. It leaked to the press almost immediately. The message was short and brutal. Nokia was standing on a burning platform. Symbian was the fire. Apple had redefined what a smartphone was supposed to be. Android was accelerating every single quarter. Nokia had two choices: stay and burn, or jump. His answer: abandon Symbian entirely. Switch to Microsoft's Windows Phone. The logic wasn't completely wrong. On Android, Nokia would be one of dozens of manufacturers fighting Samsung for scraps. On Windows Phone, they could be the defining hardware partner, the company that owned the platform experience itself. Differentiation over competition. But the memo's leak changed everything. Elop had just told the entire world, and every phone buyer on Earth, that Nokia's current software was a dead end. That anyone purchasing a Symbian device was buying something with no future. Sales dropped by more than a third in the following quarter. The Lumia 800 and Lumia 710 arrived in late 2011. The hardware design was solid, but the App Store was nearly empty. Developers had already committed to iOS and Android. There was no reason to build for a third platform run by a company that was visibly struggling. Over 2 years, Nokia sold 36 million Lumia devices total. Apple sold 150 million iPhones in 2013 alone. When Elop joined in 2010, Nokia held 33% of the smartphone market. When he left in 2014, that number had collapsed to below 3%. The stock that once peaked at €65 in the year 2000 now sat frozen at €1.33. A 98% destruction of value. The company that had once made half the phones on Earth was one step away from becoming a footnote in history. But behind every headline about Nokia's collapse, one man was quietly building an escape route that nobody saw coming. Risto Siilasmaa became Nokia's chairman in May 2012, at what he later described as the lowest moment in the company's entire history. Revenues dropped another 20% that year. Operating losses were running at €2.3 billion. The press wasn't covering Nokia's struggles anymore. They were writing the obituary. Siilasmaa later described what came next as removing the engines, the cabin, and the wings from a plane mid-flight, then reassembling it into something completely different while it was still in the air. In January 2013, Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer reached out about acquiring Nokia's phone division. Siilasmaa initially pushed back. He still believed a turnaround was possible. But as the losses kept compounding, he arrived at a conclusion that most executives never reach in time. The only way to save Nokia was to let go of the very thing that made Nokia famous. September 2013, Microsoft announced it would acquire Nokia's device and services business for $7.2 billion. Critics called it the death of Nokia. Some accused Elop of having deliberately engineered the entire decline to deliver the company to his former employer at Microsoft. The headlines were brutal. But Siilasmaa had already made a second move that nobody was paying attention to. Since 2007, Nokia had been quietly running a network infrastructure division as a joint venture with Siemens. Boring business. Not glamorous. Nobody wrote articles about it. It built the invisible systems that every phone call and data connection depended on. Before the Microsoft deal was even announced publicly, Siilasmaa quietly bought out Siemens' entire stake in that joint venture for €1.7 billion. The strategy was clean and completely counterintuitive. Stop making the phones. On the networks every phone runs on. 2 years after buying Nokia's phone business, Microsoft wrote off $7.6 billion, more than the entire purchase price, and eliminated 7,800 jobs. The phone line was discontinued. The Lumia brand vanished entirely. Nokia had sold a sinking ship, collected the cash, kept their patents, and walked away with a network business they now owned outright. That remains one of the most quietly brilliant exits any technology company has ever executed. But surviving a crisis is one thing. Building a real future from the wreckage is something else entirely. Rajiv Suri became CEO in May 2014. Not an outsider brought in to restructure. He was the executive who had made the network division profitable in the first place. Now he had to scale it into something capable of competing with the two giants that controlled the telecom infrastructure market, Ericsson and Huawei. The problem was obvious. Ericsson and Huawei sold complete portfolios, end-to-end infrastructure covering everything from radio towers to the routing systems connecting them. Nokia only had wireless. Carriers didn't want to manage multiple vendors. To compete seriously, Nokia needed to offer the entire stack. In April 2015, Suri made his move. Nokia announced it would acquire Alcatel-Lucent, a French-American telecom giant, for €15.6 billion, bigger than Nokia itself. In the middle of a period when the press was still writing skeptical pieces about whether Nokia had any future at all. The deal filled every gap Nokia had: IP routing, fixed networks, optical transport. But it came with something even more valuable than the product portfolio: Bell Labs, one of the most legendary research institutions in history, the birthplace of cellular network technology. the lab that produced Nobel Prize winners, invented the transistor, and held over 20,000 active patents. With Bell Labs, Nokia had acquired the R&D engine to lead 5G, not follow it. Suri called the new Nokia the Western alternative to Huawei. At the time it sounded like a marketing line. 4 years later, it became government policy. January 2018. Bell Labs delivered exactly what Suri had been promising. Nokia unveiled ReefShark, a 5G chipset that tripled bandwidth to 84 gigabits per second while cutting power consumption by 64%. 30 operators signed up immediately for trials. Nokia had something technically competitive again. Then Huawei's luck ran out overnight. May 2019, the US government banned Huawei from American networks, citing national security concerns. The company that had dominated global telecom infrastructure for 2 decades, consistently undercutting competitors by around 30% on price, was locked out of the world's most important market. Britain followed over a year later, ordering carriers to strip all Huawei equipment from their 5G networks by 2027. Country after country across Europe and Asia-Pacific issued their own restrictions. Western carriers suddenly needed a new vendor. And they needed one fast. Nokia stepped in. They won contracts with BT, Britain's largest operator. In the US, they signed agreements with AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile. By October 2020, Nokia had 100 commercial 5G contracts worldwide. The positioning Suri had built over years stopped being aspirational. It became a business reality. But then, one by one, the contracts started disappearing. And Nokia found itself running out of options once again, until a phone call from Jensen Huang changed everything. October 28, 2025. NVIDIA held their GTC conference in Washington, D.C. Huang chose that location deliberately. He wanted lawmakers in the room when he said this. Even after banning Huawei, America still had no domestic platform for 6G. The country's entire wireless infrastructure, the system every phone, every connected device, every emergency service ran on, was built on foreign technology. Huang had spent 2 decades building the chips that power artificial intelligence. But he understood that the next phase of AI wouldn't live in data centers. It would live at the edge. Autonomous vehicles, surgical robots, industrial drones, AR systems, anything that needs to make a decision in tens of milliseconds cannot afford a round trip to a server farm hundreds of miles away. The computation has to happen at the tower, at the exact moment the signal arrives. And the telecom industry, $3 trillion of infrastructure, millions of base stations deployed across every continent, had never been built for that. NVIDIA needed a telecom partner. But not just any partner. Ericsson's architecture was built around Intel hardware. Switching to NVIDIA chips meant tearing their entire platform apart and starting from scratch. Nokia's infrastructure was different. Their inline processing design could run NVIDIA's AI workloads directly without a complete rebuild. Among the major Western vendors, Nokia was the only one architecturally ready to make this transition without starting over. So Huang made his move. NVIDIA invested $1 billion into Nokia, making NVIDIA their second largest shareholder. He stood next to Nokia's CEO on stage and said plainly, "Thank you for helping the United States bring telecom technology back to America." The market responded immediately. Nokia's stock jumped 22% in a single day, their biggest gain since 2013. But that number isn't the point. The point is what they're building together. Today, cell towers move data. They receive signals, relay information, and hand off connections as you travel. That's it. Sophisticated pipes. Under the NVIDIA-Nokia partnership, towers become processors. AI runs directly on the hardware at the base station, analyzing signals in real time, optimizing bandwidth, cutting energy consumption by up to 30%, and reducing latency to the point where responses arrive in milliseconds, not seconds. For the 800 million people already using AI assistants every week, most of them on their phones, this means faster, smarter, and more responsive experiences starting now. For what's coming next, it means something far bigger. The next generation of AI systems won't just answer questions. They'll navigate vehicles, control robotic surgery, manage logistics networks, and power devices that need to sense and react to the physical world continuously. None of that works if every computation requires a trip to a distant data center. It only works if the intelligence is embedded in the infrastructure itself. Nokia's CEO called it putting an AI data center into everyone's pocket. Analysts estimate the AI radio access network market will exceed $200 billion by 2030. T-Mobile already signed on as the first customer, with live trials scheduled to begin in 2026. If this technology delivers at scale, Nokia and NVIDIA won't just be competing with Ericsson. They could restructure the entire telecom industry around a new architecture that no legacy vendor is positioned to match. Looking back across everything, the collapse, the sale, the rebuild, the near collapse again, and now this, 3 decisions stand out as the ones that actually kept Nokia alive. The first, sell your most famous asset before it becomes worthless. In 2013, Nokia's phone business was still valuable enough to fetch $7.2 billion. 2 years later, that same business was worth negative money. Microsoft took a $7.6 billion write-down and shut it down entirely. Most companies in Nokia's position would have held on. Another restructuring, another turnaround CEO, watching the asset decay to zero. Nokia let go while there was still something to sell. The second, spend crisis money on expansion, not survival. After the Microsoft deal closed, Nokia had billions in cash and every rational reason to stabilize. Instead, they dropped 15.6 billion euros on Alcatel-Lucent, a company larger than themselves, while the press was still questioning whether Nokia had any future at all. That acquisition didn't just fill product gaps. It gave them Bell Labs and the technical credibility to lead 5G. The third, bet on what you already own. Nokia didn't pivot to something new. They pivoted to something they'd always had, a network infrastructure division that had been running quietly since 2007. Not glamorous. Nobody wrote news about it. Most Nokia watchers had forgotten it existed. When the phone business collapsed, that overlooked division became the foundation for everything that came next. The asset that saved Nokia wasn't something they built in a crisis. It was something they'd owned the entire time. Looking back across everything, the collapse, the sale, the rebuild, the near collapse again, and now this, 3 decisions stand out as the ones that actually kept Nokia alive. The first, sell your most famous asset before it becomes worthless. In 2013, Nokia's phone business was still valuable enough to fetch $7.2 billion. 2 years later, that same business was worth negative money. Microsoft took a $7.6 billion write-down and shut it down entirely. Most companies in Nokia's position would have held on. Another restructuring, another turnaround CO, watching the asset decay to zero. Nokia let go while there was still something to sell. The second, spend crisis money on expansion, not survival. After the Microsoft deal closed, Nokia had billions in cash and every rational reason to stabilize. Instead, they dropped 15.6 billion euros on Alcatel-Lucent, a company larger than themselves, while the press was still questioning whether Nokia had any future at all. That acquisition didn't just fill product gaps. It gave them Bell Labs and the technical credibility to lead 5G. The third, bet on what you already own. Nokia didn't pivot to something new. They pivoted to something they'd always had, a network infrastructure division that had been running quietly since 2007. Not glamorous. Nobody wrote news about it. Most Nokia watchers had forgotten it existed. When the phone business collapsed, that overlooked division became the foundation for everything that came next. The asset that saved Nokia wasn't something they built in a crisis. It was something they'd owned the entire time.